The screech of sneakers against polished hardwood echoed through Lincoln High's gymnasium as 16-year-old Marcus Chen dribbled down the court, sweat glistening under harsh fluorescent lights. It was March 15, 2015, a Friday night that should have ended with celebration. Instead, it became the last time anyone would see Marcus alive. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. The smell of stale popcorn filled the air as Lincoln High faced Westfield Academy in the regional championship semifinals. Marcus's mother, Linda Chen, sat clutching a worn team photo, her knuckles white with nervous energy. "Defense! Defense!" Marcus shouted, his jersey number 23 soaked with sweat as he pushed his teammates toward victory. The final buzzer pierced. The gymnasium at 9:47 p.m. Lincoln High had won 78-74. Marcus raised his arms in triumph, his smile visible from the cheap seats. His teammates lifted him onto their shoulders as camera flashes illuminated the celebration. Linda made her way through the crowd. The last photo ever taken of Marcus shows him in that moment. Arms raised, eyes bright, completely unaware he had less than 30 minutes left in the world he knew. "Great game, honey," Linda called out. Marcus jogged over, still breathing heavily. "Did you see that three-pointer in the fourth quarter, Mom?" His eyes sparkled with pure joy. "I saw everything, baby. I'm so proud of you." Those would be the last words Linda Chen ever spoke to her son. At 10:15 p.m., Marcus hugged his mother goodbye in the parking lot. Security cameras captured him walking toward the team bus, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, his lucky red high-top sneakers squeaking against the asphalt. But Marcus never made it to the bus. At 10:18 p.m., security cameras captured a figure that looked like Marcus walking away from the gymnasium, alone, into darkness beyond the streetlights. That was the last confirmed sighting of Marcus Chen. When the team bus pulled away at 10:25 p.m., Coach Williams assumed Marcus had caught a ride with his mother. When Linda arrived home expecting to find Marcus there, she assumed he'd gone out with teammates. It wasn't until 2:30 a.m. that Linda Chen realized her son had vanished into thin air. But what really happened in those crucial minutes after the game? And why would a boy with everything to live for simply walk away from his moment of triumph? The answer would remain buried for exactly 8 years, 4 months, and 12 days, until a morning jogger stumbled upon something that would crack this case wide open and reveal a conspiracy that reached far beyond one missing teenager. Dawn broke over Lincoln, Pennsylvania, with an unsettling stillness. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and dying leaves as Linda Chen stood in her kitchen, staring at Marcus's untouched breakfast plate. The scrambled eggs had long gone cold, congealing into a yellow mass that seemed to mock her hope. The first 24 hours after a disappearance are crucial. Every detective knows this. But Linda Chen wasn't a detective. She was a single mother whose world had shattered somewhere between midnight and dawn, leaving her grasping at fragments of normalcy. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at the Chen household at 8:30 a.m., his weathered face bearing the expression of someone who had delivered bad news too many times. The living room felt smaller with his presence, walls closing in around family photos that suddenly seemed like evidence of a life that might be over. Morrison's pen scratched against his notepad as Linda recounted the previous evening. Every detail felt simultaneously crucial and meaningless. Marcus's excitement about the game, his plans for the championship, the way he'd kissed her cheek before walking toward that bus he never reached. The search began with Marcus's teammates, young faces drawn tight with concern as they gathered in the school parking lot. The same asphalt that had witnessed Marcus's final steps now crawled with police officers, their radios crackling with updates that led nowhere. By noon, the local news had picked up the story. Channel 7's van parked across from Lincoln High, its satellite dish extended like an accusatory finger pointing at the sky. The reporter, a blonde woman with perfectly styled hair, practiced her lines while standing exactly where Marcus had last been seen. But it was Marcus's best friend, Tony Rodriguez, who provided the first real lead. His hands shook as he spoke to Detective Morrison in the gymnasium's empty locker room, the smell of teenage sweat and disinfectant heavy in the air. "Marcus got a text during halftime," Tony whispered, his voice barely audible above the building's settling groans. "He looked weird after reading it. Like scared." Morrison's eyebrows raised. Phone records would become crucial evidence, but Marcus's cell phone had vanished with him, leaving behind only digital footprints that told half a story. The search expanded beyond Lincoln's borders as volunteers arrived from neighboring towns. They combed through Riverside Park, where Marcus used to practice shooting hoops alone, their voices calling his name until the sound became a desperate hymn echoing off empty trees. Linda Chen walked those same paths, clutching one of Marcus's worn T-shirts, hoping his scent might somehow guide her to him. The fabric still smelled like his cologne, a cheap drugstore brand he'd bought with his own allowance, worn with the pride of someone becoming a man. As the sun set on March 16th, Detective Morrison stood in his car outside the Chen house, watching Linda's silhouette move past the living room window. 24 hours had passed, and Marcus Chen remained a ghost, present in every corner of the community's consciousness, but absent from the world that desperately needed him back. The investigation had only just begun, but already Morrison sensed something larger lurking beneath this disappearance. The mysterious text, the perfect timing, the complete absence of evidence, it all felt too clean, too orchestrated. What forces had been set in motion that Friday night? And how far would this case take them from the simple story of a boy who walked away from a basketball game and never came home? The Lincoln Police Department's technology unit occupied a cramped basement office that smelled of stale coffee and electronic circuits. Officer Sarah Kim sat hunched over multiple monitors, their blue glow reflecting off her glasses, as she navigated through Marcus Chen's digital life. Phone records revealed a pattern that made Detective Morrison's stomach clench. 3 calls to Marcus's number in the hours before his disappearance, all from burner phones, untraceable numbers that existed solely to deliver messages and vanish. The mysterious halftime text Tony Rodriguez had mentioned contained only 7 words. "Meet us where you practice, alone, tonight." Marcus's social media painted the picture of a typical teenager. Basketball highlights, jokes with friends, photos from school events. But deeper analysis revealed something unsettling. Someone had been watching his online activity closely, noting his routines, his favorite places, his schedule. Linda Chen sat across from Officer Kim, her hands twisted in her lap as the investigation unfolded on computer screens. Every click of the keyboard felt like another step away from her son, deeper into a digital maze she couldn't understand. The Riverside Park connection haunted the investigators. Marcus's phone had pinged cell towers near the abandoned basketball courts exactly 17 minutes after leaving the school parking lot. Then, silence, as if the device had simply ceased to exist. Crime scene technicians combed through the Idrifi courts where Marcus spent countless hours perfecting his shots. The chain-link fence bore no signs of struggle. The asphalt held no secrets, and the rusty hoop where he dreamed of NBA stardom stood silent as a gravestone. But technology revealed what human eyes missed. Traffic cameras caught fragments of movement on Route 34, the road leading to Riverside Park. Enhanced images showed a dark sedan following approximately 2 minutes behind Marcus's route, its license plate obscured by mud that seemed deliberately applied. Detective Morrison spread the photographs across his desk like tarot cards predicting doom. The timeline emerged piece by piece. Marcus receives the text, leaves his teammates, walks to the park, disappears into a void that had swallowed other secrets. The investigation expanded to include federal resources when Officer Kim discovered something that changed everything. Marcus's computer contained encrypted files that required specialized software to decode. Files a 16-year-old basketball player should never have possessed. The files contained names, dates, and locations that painted Lincoln, Pennsylvania as something far more sinister than a quiet small town. Drug routes, money laundering operations, and most disturbing of all, a list of potential witnesses who might threaten ongoing criminal enterprises. Marcus Chen's name appeared on that list. Linda Chen received this news in Detective Morrison's office, surrounded by case files that transformed her son from victim to potential threat in the eyes of people who eliminated problems with cold efficiency. Your son may have stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see, Morrison explained, his voice gentle but urgent. People who run operations like this don't leave loose ends. The weight of this revelation settled over Linda like a burial shroud. Her son hadn't been randomly selected. He'd been targeted, silenced, erased with the precision of a military operation. As night fell over Lincoln, investigators realized they weren't just searching for a missing teenager anymore. They were unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government, law enforcement, and business community. But how deep did this corruption run? And what had Marcus Chen discovered that made him dangerous, enough to disappear? The encrypted files on Marcus Chen's computer revealed a web of corruption that stretched through Lincoln like poison in the water supply. Detective Morrison sat in his car outside City Hall at 3 a.m., studying surveillance photos that showed respected community members entering and leaving buildings at unusual hours. Mayor Patricia Kellerman appeared in 17 different photographs, her silver Mercedes parked behind warehouses that officially stored farm equipment but actually processed something far more profitable. The woman who'd won election on a platform of community safety was orchestrating the very crimes that threatened it. Marcus's files contained detailed records of conversations he'd somehow overheard or recorded. Audio files played back voices, discussing shipment schedules, payoff amounts, and elimination of problems that threatened their operation. The teenage basketball star had unwittingly become Lincoln's most dangerous investigative journalist. Dr. Robert Hayes, the school's beloved principal, appeared prominently in the conspiracy. His voice emerged from speakers describing how student-athletes made perfect couriers, their travel to away games providing cover for moving product across state lines. The trust parents placed in this man had been weaponized against their children. The revelation hit Detective Morrison like physical pain. His own daughter attended Lincoln High, had sat in Dr. Hayes' office receiving college counseling while the man planned criminal enterprises that destroyed other families. Linda Chen learned these truths in a secure conference room at the state police barracks, surrounded by federal agents who spoke in measured tones about witness protection programs and relocating to distant cities with new identities. Your son discovered something that threatens millions of dollars in illegal revenue, Agent Patricia Wells explained, her manila folders containing evidence that would eventually topple local government. People have killed for much less. The IDD scope of the operation stunned even experienced federal investigators. Lincoln's geographic position made it perfect for moving heroin from urban centers to rural communities throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The basketball team's travel schedule provided ideal cover for transportation, while the school's reputation eliminated suspicion. Marcus had discovered this network through sheer accident. His after-school job cleaning offices had given him access to conversations between Mayor Kellerman and her associates. His teenage curiosity had led him to record these discussions, creating evidence that could destroy powerful people. The encrypted files revealed Marcus's growing awareness of the danger he'd stumbled into. His final entries showed fear, confusion, and ultimately a decision to meet his contacts at Riverside Park, a decision that sealed his fate. Federal agents descended on Lincoln like an occupying force, their black SUVs parked outside locations that had harbored criminal activity for years. Search warrants executed simultaneously across the county revealed cash, drugs, and weapons hidden in businesses that served as fronts for the operation. Mayor Kellerman's arrest at 6 a.m. became front-page news across Pennsylvania. The woman who'd posed for countless photos with school children was led away in handcuffs, while FBI agents seized computers, financial records, and communications that documented years of criminal enterprise. But Marcus Chen remained missing, his fate unknown despite the collapse of the conspiracy he'd discovered. The people responsible for his disappearance had been arrested, their operation dismantled. Yet the question that haunted Linda Chen persisted. Where was her son? Detective Morrison stood in the empty Riverside Park basketball court, watching federal agents process the scene with technology unavailable to local police. The rusty hoop where Marcus had practiced stood silhouetted against storm clouds that promised rain. 8 years would pass before this sacred ground revealed its secrets, before a morning jogger's discovery would finally provide answers to questions that had haunted an entire community. But what happened to Marcus Chen in those final moments? And why would it take nearly a decade for the truth to surface? Time moved differently for Linda Chen after the arrests. Days blurred into months, months into years, while Marcus's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it. Basketball trophies gathering dust, college recruitment letters unopened on his desk, dreams suspended in amber. Detective Morrison retired in 2018, but the Marcus Chen case followed him into civilian life like a shadow. His replacement, Detective Angela Torres, inherited boxes of evidence that filled an entire storage room, each document a piece of a puzzle that refused to reveal its complete picture. The federal trials consumed 2 years and resulted in 17 convictions, including Mayor Kellerman's 25-year sentence. Principal Hayes died by suicide in his jail cell before trial, leaving behind a note that mentioned Marcus by name but revealed no details about his ultimate fate. Lincoln struggled to rebuild its reputation after the scandal. New leadership promised transparency and accountability, but residents whispered about other secrets that might still lurk beneath their community's surface. Trust, once broken, proved nearly impossible to restore. Linda Chen aged years in the eerie span of months. Her hair turned gray, her smile disappeared, and her world contracted to the boundaries of grief that no resolution could fully heal. She attended every trial, hoping defendants might reveal information about Marcus's location, but the convicted criminals maintained their silence. The basketball program at Lincoln High was suspended for 3 years. The gymnasium where Marcus had played his final game became a storage facility, its hardwood floors covered with boxes of old textbooks and forgotten equipment. The echo of sneakers and cheering crowds faded into memory. Private investigators hired by Linda Chen scoured the region for any trace of her son. They interviewed former associates of the criminal network, analyzed satellite imagery of potential burial sites, and followed leads that invariably led nowhere. Each dead end cost money Linda couldn't afford, and hope she couldn't spare. Detective Torres reviewed the case files annually, applying new technologies and investigative techniques to evidence that had been thoroughly examined countless times. DNA analysis, enhanced computer forensics, and geographical profiling all failed to locate Marcus or determine his fate. The media eventually lost interest, moving on to fresher tragedies that captured public attention. Marcus Chen became another statistic, another unsolved disappearance that haunted law enforcement databases but no longer generated headlines. By 2020, only Linda Chen and Detective Torres actively pursued the case. They met monthly at a coffee shop near the police station, sharing theories and updates that never produced breakthrough moments. These conversations became rituals of hope, maintained against impossible odds. The COVID-19 pandemic further slowed the investigation as resources shifted to public health emergencies. The Marcus Chen case file gathered dust in storage, while the world focused on immediate crises that overshadowed cold cases from a different era. Linda Chen celebrated, if celebration was the right word, Marcus's 21st birthday alone in his bedroom, surrounded by photos that showed him frozen at 16, forever young, while everyone around him aged. She lit candles on a cake no one would eat and whispered promises to never stop searching. The conspiracy that had claimed Marcus was dead and buried, its key players imprisoned or deceased, but justice felt incomplete without knowing his fate. The trials had answered questions about corruption and criminal enterprise while leaving the most important question unanswered: what happened to Marcus Chen? As 2023 began, 8 years after that fateful basketball game, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. Lincoln had moved on, built new institutions, elected new leaders, and created new memories to replace the painful ones. But sometimes the truth waits patiently in places no one thinks to look, gathering strength like seeds in winter soil, preparing for a spring that will change everything. What secrets lay hidden in the familiar places of Lincoln? And how would a routine morning run finally crack open a case that had defeated experienced investigators for nearly a decade? Jennifer Walsh had been running the same route through Miller's Woods for 3 years, her Nike sneakers following worn paths that connected Lincoln's residential neighborhoods to the nature preserve beyond. July 27, 2023 began like any other summer morning. Humid air, thick with the scent of pine and wildflowers, birds chirping their dawn chorus, while joggers and dog walkers claimed the trails. The storm from the previous night had transformed familiar terrain. Fallen branches blocked regular paths, forcing Jennifer to venture into sections of the woods she'd never explored. Her GPS watch showed 4.2 miles when she spotted something red protruding from beneath a rotting log that had been displaced by wind and rain. At first glance, it looked like trash, perhaps a discarded fast food container or abandoned toy. But, as Jennifer approached, the object's shape became unmistakable. A high-top sneaker, faded and weathered, but still recognizable as athletic footwear. The shoe emerged from 8 years of earth and decay, like evidence from an archaeological dig. Mud caked the once red canvas, but the distinctive pattern remained visible. A pattern that Jennifer recognized from countless missing person flyers that had papered Lincoln years earlier. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, the morning's peaceful solitude shattered by the realization that she'd stumbled upon potential evidence in the area's most notorious unsolved case. Detective Torres arrived within 20 minutes, followed by crime scene technicians who approached the discovery with the reverence reserved for sacred artifacts. The shoe was photographed from every angle before being carefully extracted from its earthen tomb. Inside the sneaker, protected by canvas and rubber from years of weather, investigators found a folded piece of paper, a handwritten note that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about Marcus Chen's disappearance. The note, written in Marcus's recognizable handwriting, contained coordinates, names, and a single line that sent chills through everyone who read it. If you're reading this, they got me. But the real evidence is where we used to play. Detective Torres stood in Miller's Woods, holding evidence that transformed the case from missing person to homicide investigation. The coordinates referenced a location deeper in the forest, approximately half a mile from where the shoe had been discovered. Linda Chen received the news in her kitchen, the same room where she'd waited for Marcus to come home 8 years earlier. Detective Torres's words seemed to come from underwater, distorted by grief and hope and terror that had been building for nearly a decade. The search team assembled that afternoon included state police, federal agents, and specialized forensics experts. They followed Marcus's coordinates through dense underbrush to a small clearing that had been disturbed sometime in the past, earth that had settled unevenly, revealing secrets beneath. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what everyone feared and expected: human remains buried approximately 4 feet below the surface, along with other objects that had been hidden alongside them. The excavation began at dawn on July 28th, with Linda Chen standing at the perimeter of the crime scene, watching investigators uncover the truth she'd sought for 8 years. Each shovelful of earth removed was another step toward answers that would forever change how she understood her son's final hours. But Marcus's burial site contained more than just his remains. The other objects discovered would reveal the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed his life. Evidence he'd hidden before his killers found him. Insurance that would eventually expose truths even more shocking than anyone had imagined. What had Marcus Chen discovered that was worth killing for? And what evidence had he preserved that would finally deliver justice from beyond the grave? The waterproof case emerged from Marcus Chen's grave like a time capsule from hell. Inside, perfectly preserved after 8 years underground, lay evidence that would shatter what investigators thought they knew about the Lincoln conspiracy. USB drives contained video recordings Marcus had secretly made during his office cleaning job. The footage showed Mayor Kellerman, Principal Hayes, and others planning operations that extended far beyond local drug trafficking. These weren't small-town criminals. They were part of a network that reached into state government and federal agencies. Detective Torres played the videos in a secure conference room, while federal agents took notes that would reshape multiple ongoing investigations. Marcus's teenage voice narrated what he was seeing, his fear palpable as he documented meetings that discussed eliminating witnesses and covering up murders. The most damaging recording showed Police Chief Frank Morrison, Detective Ray Morrison's brother, coordinating with criminals to ensure certain investigations were buried or misdirected. The police department that had searched for Marcus had been compromised from the beginning, sabotaging their own investigation. Linda Chen learned that her son had been even braver than she'd imagined. The final video, recorded the day of his disappearance, showed Marcus copying files from Principal Hayes' computer while explaining his plan to hide the evidence where only he knew to look. "If something happens to me, Mom, I want you to know I tried to do the right thing," Marcus whispered into his phone's camera. "These people hurt kids, and somebody has to stop them." The buried evidence revealed that Marcus hadn't been lured to Riverside Park randomly. He'd arranged to meet someone he trusted, someone who'd promised to help him expose the conspiracy, but instead led him to his death. That person was Coach Williams, whose tearful testimony 8 years earlier about Marcus's final moments had been a carefully crafted lie designed to misdirect the investigation away from the truth. Federal agents arrested Coach Williams at his home in Virginia, where he'd relocated after retiring from Lincoln High. His neighbors watched in shock as the man they knew as a youth baseball volunteer was led away in handcuffs for conspiracy to commit murder. The coach's confession, delivered in a sterile interview room after hours of questioning, revealed the full scope of Marcus's final night. The teenager had trusted his mentor completely, following him into Miller's Woods, believing they would meet FBI agents who would protect him while he provided evidence. Instead, Coach Williams had led Marcus to his execution, carried out by professional killers who'd been hired to eliminate the threat he posed. The coach had been paid $50,000 for his betrayal, blood money that he'd never spent, keeping it hidden in a safety deposit box like evidence of his own guilt. Marcus Chen had died believing help was coming, trusting the adult who'd taught him about teamwork and dedication. His final moments had been spent not understanding why his mentor was walking away, leaving him alone with strangers who showed no mercy. The medical examiner's report confirmed what the evidence suggested. Marcus had been killed by a single gunshot to the head, executed professionally, and buried in a grave that had been prepared in advance. His killers had planned every detail except for Marcus's foresight in hiding evidence that would eventually expose them. Linda Chen sat in Detective Torres's office, surrounded by case files that finally told her son's complete story. Justice felt hollow after 8 years of uncertainty, but the truth provided something she desperately needed: proof that Marcus had died as a hero, not a victim. The buried evidence would eventually result in dozens of additional arrests as federal investigators unraveled criminal networks that had operated across multiple states. Marcus Chen's courage had saved other children from exploitation and violence that would have continued without his sacrifice. But questions remained about how deep this conspiracy had reached, and who else had been silenced to protect secrets that were worth killing for. How many other victims lay buried in unmarked graves, their stories waiting for someone brave enough to tell them? Coach Williams sat in the federal interrogation room, his weathered hands trembling as he recounted the events of March 15, 2015. The man who'd once inspired teenage athletes now looked broken, aged far beyond his 68 years by the weight of secrets he'd carried for 8 years. The confession revealed layers of betrayal that cut deeper than anyone had imagined. Williams hadn't just been corrupted by money. He'd been blackmailed into compliance through photographs that showed him in compromising situations with underage students. They had pictures, Williams whispered, his voice barely audible above the interrogation room's buzzing fluorescent lights. Said they'd destroy my family, my reputation, everything I'd worked for. The criminal network had systematically identified and compromised trusted community figures, creating a web of complicity that ensured silence and cooperation. Teachers, coaches, police officers, and city officials had all been ensnared through blackmail, bribery, or threats against their families. Marcus Chen had unknowingly threatened this entire system when he began documenting their activities. His recordings hadn't just captured drug trafficking operations. They'd revealed the psychological warfare used to control decent people and force them into criminal acts. Detective Torres studied crime scene photos from Miller's Woods, noting details that took on new significance with Williams's confession. The grave had been dug by Williams himself, the man who'd taught Marcus the importance of preparation and attention to detail, now applying those lessons to murder. The coach described Marcus's final moments with the clinical detachment of someone who'd rehearsed the story countless times in his mind. The teenager had followed his mentor into the woods, excited about meeting FBI agents who would help him expose the conspiracy. He kept asking when they were going to arrive, Williams continued, tears streaming down his face. I couldn't look at him, couldn't tell him the truth about what was really happening. The professional killers had been waiting in the clearing. 2. Men whose identities remained unknown even to Williams. They'd instructed him to leave before the execution, sparing him from witnessing the murder he'd enabled, but not from carrying its weight forever. Williams had returned to his car and driven straight to a bar, where security cameras captured him drinking alone until closing time. His alibi for Marcus's murder was perfect because he hadn't technically committed it. He'd simply delivered the victim to those who would. The revelation devastated Linda Chen, who'd trusted Williams completely during the initial investigation. The man who'd hugged her at Marcus's memorial service, who'd promised to do everything possible to find her son, had been the architect of his death. Federal agents traced Williams's financial records, uncovering payments that began years before Marcus's death. The coach had been a long-term asset of the criminal network, helping identify vulnerable students who could be exploited or eliminated if they became threats. The investigation revealed that Marcus wasn't their first victim. 3 other students from Lincoln High had died in apparent accidents or suicides over the previous decade, young people who'd stumbled upon information that made them dangerous to powerful interests. Sarah Martinez, a junior who'd died in a car accident in 2012, had been researching a story for the school newspaper about unusual activity at local businesses. David Thompson, a senior who'd allegedly overdosed in 2013, had been asking questions about why certain athletes received special privileges from school administrators. Each death had been carefully orchestrated to appear natural or self-inflicted, removing threats while avoiding the scrutiny that obvious murders would have attracted. Marcus's disappearance had been intended as another runaway teenager case that would eventually be forgotten. But Marcus's preparation and courage had disrupted their perfect system. His hidden evidence transformed what should have been a clean elimination into the beginning of their downfall, ensuring that his death would eventually expose the entire conspiracy. Williams's cooperation led federal agents to safe houses where other evidence had been stored, financial records that traced money laundering operations across state lines, and communications that implicated officials at the highest levels of Pennsylvania government. The coach would spend his remaining years in federal prison, haunted by the student he'd betrayed and the system he'd helped protect. But his confession finally provided Linda Chen with complete knowledge of how and why her son had died, knowledge that was both devastating and strangely comforting. How many other Coach Williams existed in communities across America? And how many other Marcus Chens had their courage silenced before the truth could set them free? The evidence Marcus Chen had died protecting triggered the largest organized crime investigation in Pennsylvania's history. FBI agents descended upon Lincoln like an army, their black SUVs lined up outside buildings that had harbored criminal activity for decades. Operation Mockingbird, named for the way the conspiracy had corrupted voices meant to protect the community, resulted in simultaneous raids across 17 counties. Search warrants executed at dawn revealed the true scope of the network Marcus had stumbled upon while cleaning offices after school. The Lincoln conspiracy had been just one node in a criminal enterprise that stretched from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, involving politicians, judges, law enforcement officials, and business leaders who'd created a shadow government operating within the legitimate one. Marcus's recordings revealed how the system worked. Legitimate businesses served as fronts for money laundering operations, while corrupt officials ensured investigations were misdirected or buried entirely. Student-athletes from multiple school districts were unknowingly used as couriers, their travel schedules providing perfect cover for moving drugs and cash. Federal prosecutors assembled a case that read like organized crime fiction, except the evidence was real, and the victims were children whose trust had been weaponized against entire communities. Grand juries in multiple jurisdictions issued indictments that would take years to prosecute fully. The network's sophistication stunned even experienced investigators. They'd infiltrated school boards, police departments, and judicial systems, ensuring that any threats to their operations would be eliminated before reaching courts or media outlets. Judge Harold Brennan, who'd presided over numerous cases involving network associates, was arrested at his country club while playing golf with other members of Lincoln's elite. The man who'd sentenced drug dealers to probation while imposing harsh penalties on legitimate citizens had been compromised for over a decade. Sheriff's Deputy Mike Collins, who'd participated in searches for Marcus Chen, was revealed as the network's primary law enforcement contact. His access to police databases had allowed criminals to identify potential witnesses and threats before they could testify against the organization. The arrests continued for weeks as investigators followed money trails and communication networks that implicated hundreds of individuals across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. Each new revelation painted Marcus Chen's murder as both more senseless and more heroic. A teenager who'd died protecting communities he'd never even visited. Dr. Elizabeth Stone, the county coroner who'd ruled several suspicious deaths as accidents or suicides, confessed to falsifying autopsy reports to hide evidence of murder. The students who'd died before Marcus had been silenced just as efficiently, their deaths disguised so perfectly that no one had suspected homicide. Marcus's evidence revealed the psychological profiles the network maintained on potential threats. Teachers, students, parents, and community leaders were all cataloged based on their curiosity, connections, and likelihood to cause problems for criminal operations. The teenager had appeared on their watch list after asking questions about why certain businesses received special treatment from city officials. His after-school job had been arranged specifically to provide surveillance opportunities. But Marcus's intelligence and courage had turned the tables on his would-be controllers. Linda Chen testified before a federal grand jury, describing her son's behavior in the weeks before his death, the way he'd seemed worried but determined, protective but secretive about information he couldn't share with anyone. The grand jury proceedings revealed that Marcus had tried to contact FBI field offices in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but his calls had been intercepted by corrupt officials who ensured his reports never reached honest agents. The network's penetration of law enforcement had been so complete that Marcus died believing no one would help him. Federal prosecutors estimated that the conspiracy had operated for at least 15 years, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal revenue while destroying countless lives through drug trafficking, human trafficking, and systematic corruption of government institutions. The investigation expanded to include cold cases from across the region, as authorities realized that many unsolved crimes might have been connected to the network Marcus had exposed. Missing persons, suspicious deaths, and unexplained disappearances were all re-examined through the lens of organized criminal activity. But questions remained about how such extensive corruption could have operated undetected for so long, and whether other networks existed in communities across America where brave teenagers like Marcus Chen might be the only thing standing between criminals and the children they sought to exploit. How deep did this corruption run in America's heartland? And how many other heroes had been silenced before they could expose the truth? The federal courthouse in Philadelphia became the stage where Marcus Chen's evidence would finally deliver the justice he died seeking. Courtroom 6B filled each morning with family members of victims, investigative journalists, and citizens demanding accountability for the corruption that had poisoned their communities. Linda Chen sat in the front row every day, wearing a small pin with Marcus's basketball photo, number 23 frozen in time, his smile radiating the hope and determination that had cost him his life. The trials would consume 18 months, but She attended every session as if her presence could somehow complete her son's mission. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Martinez built her case around Marcus's recordings, playing audio that revealed the casual cruelty with which the defendants had discussed eliminating threats to their operations. Jurors listened in horrified silence, as familiar voices planned murders with the same tone they might use to discuss weekend plans. Former Mayor Kellerman's defense attorneys argued that their client had been coerced into participation, but Marcus's evidence showed her enthusiastic leadership of criminal activities that had generated millions in illegal revenue. Her sentencing to life imprisonment without parole drew applause that Judge Catherine Morrison gavelled to silence. The trials revealed the network's methodology for identifying and recruiting community leaders. They'd target individuals with financial problems, family secrets, or career ambitions that could be leveraged into cooperation. Once compromised, these officials became permanent assets, unable to escape without destroying their own lives. Coach Williams testified for the prosecution as part of his plea agreement, his testimony providing crucial details about how Marcus had been manipulated and ultimately murdered. His broken voice describing the teenager's trust and excitement about helping FBI agents left jurors and spectators in tears. He believed in doing the right thing, Williams sobbed during his testimony. He believed adults would protect him if he was brave enough to speak up. I failed him in the worst possible way. Dr. Elizabeth Stone's testimony revealed the extent of the cover-up that had hidden multiple murders disguised as accidents or suicides. The former coroner admitted to falsifying autopsy reports on 17 different victims, including the 3 Lincoln High students who'd died before Marcus discovered their criminal enterprise. Judge Brennan's trial became a showcase of judicial corruption that had perverted justice for over a decade. Marcus's recordings captured the judge discussing specific cases where he'd manipulated verdicts to protect network associates while punishing innocent people who threatened their operations. The convictions mounted week after week: conspiracy, racketeering, murder, drug trafficking, money laundering, and corruption charges that would keep most defendants imprisoned for life. Each guilty verdict felt like a small victory for Marcus. Chen, posthumous justice delivered by evidence he'd risked everything to preserve. But the trials also revealed the network's international connections, suggesting that Lincoln's conspiracy was part of an even larger criminal enterprise that operated across national borders. Federal investigators announced ongoing operations, targeting similar networks in other states, other communities, where corruption had been disguised as civic leadership. Linda Chen finally spoke during the sentencing phase, addressing the defendants who'd stolen her son's future while poisoning her community's trust. Her words carried 8 years of grief, transformed into determination that Marcus's sacrifice would protect other children from similar fates. How many other communities harbored such extensive corruption? And what would it take to ensure that brave young people like Marcus Chen never again died alone and unprotected while trying to do the right thing? Linda Chen approached the witness stand on a crisp October morning, 8.5 years after her son had walked out of Lincoln High's gymnasium and into the darkness that claimed his life. The courtroom fell silent as she placed her hand on the Bible, her voice steady despite the tears that had been building since dawn. Her victim impact statement began with a simple truth that cut through months of legal proceedings and technical testimony. Marcus Chen had been a child who believed adults would protect him if he did the right thing. My son trusted his coach, his principal, his community leaders, Linda said, her eyes fixed on the defendant's table where former pillars of Lincoln society sat in orange jumpsuits. He believed that being brave and honest would keep him safe. You killed him for that trust. The courtroom absorbed every word, as Linda described the boy Marcus had been. Not just a basketball star or a tragic victim, but a teenager who'd helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, tutored struggling classmates, and dreamed of playing college basketball while studying criminal justice. She spoke about the 8 years of uncertainty that had consumed her life, the sleepless nights wondering if Marcus was alive somewhere, the hope that sustained her through countless false leads and dead ends. The not knowing had been its own form of torture, designed by people who'd calculated that a missing child caused less scrutiny than a murdered one. Linda's voice grew stronger as she addressed each defendant individually, describing how their choices had rippled through her, family, and community. Marcus's younger sister had struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering why she'd been spared when her protective older brother had been targeted for elimination. "You didn't just kill my son," Linda continued, turning to face Mayor Kellerman directly. "You killed the trust that holds communities together. You made parents afraid to let their children ask questions or stand up for what's right." The psychological impact extended beyond the Chen family to every family in Lincoln whose children had attended the corrupted school system, participated in compromised athletic programs, or lived under the protection of law enforcement officials who'd been secretly serving criminal interests. Linda described discovering Marcus's hidden courage through the evidence that had finally exposed his killers. Learning about his secret recordings, his attempts to contact federal authorities, and his careful preparation for the possibility of his own death had transformed her grief into something more complex: pride mixed with devastating loss. The teenager who'd seemed increasingly distant in his final weeks had actually been carrying the weight of knowledge that could have destroyed everyone he loved. His isolation hadn't been typical adolescent behavior. It had been the loneliness of someone protecting others from truths they couldn't handle. Marcus died because he loved his community more than he feared for his own safety, Linda testified, her words carrying across the packed courtroom to family members of other victims who'd found their own truth through her son's sacrifice. She spoke about the additional victims whose deaths had been disguised as accidents or suicides, young people who'd been silenced before they could expose the corruption that Marcus eventually documented. Their families deserved justice too, and Marcus's evidence had finally provided it. Judge Morrison listened as Linda described her son's final video message, recorded on his phone the day he disappeared. Marcus had spoken directly to his mother, apologizing for the secrets he'd kept, and expressing hope that his evidence would protect other children from the dangers he'd discovered. "He said he was sorry for not being able to tell me what was happening," Linda recounted through tears that finally came. "He was 16 years old and apologizing for being brave enough to do what the adults around him should have done." The BTUA defense attorneys had no questions for Linda Chen. Her testimony stood as an indictment not just of their client's crimes, but of a system that had failed to protect a child who'd tried to protect others. As Linda stepped down from the witness stand, she looked once more at the defendants who'd stolen her son's future. Her final words would haunt the courtroom long after the trials ended. Marcus believed that truth and justice would prevail if he was just brave enough to speak up. You killed him for that belief, but you couldn't kill what he stood for. His voice is still speaking through every piece of evidence that's putting you away forever. What legacy would Marcus Chen's courage leave for other young people facing similar choices? And how many other parents would never have to endure Linda Chen's loss because one teenager had been brave enough to do what was right? The jury deliberated for 6 days, sifting through evidence that painted Lincoln, Pennsylvania, as a community betrayed by its most trusted leaders. When they filed back into courtroom 6B on November 15, 2024, their faces carried the weight of decisions that would reshape how justice was understood in small-town America. Linda Chen gripped Detective Torres's hand as the first verdict was Read. Former Mayor Patricia Kellerman stood motionless as the jury foreman pronounced her guilty on all 37 counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. Her political career, built on promises of community safety, ended with a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Judge Harold Brennan's conviction on 42 counts of corruption and conspiracy drew gasps from the gallery, packed with families whose cases he'd manipulated over the years. Marcus's evidence had captured the judge discussing specific verdicts he'd fixed, defendants he'd protected, and innocent people he'd punished to maintain the network's control over Lincoln's justice system. Sheriff's Deputy Mike Collins received 3 consecutive life sentences for his role in Marcus's murder and the cover-up that followed. His access to police databases had made him invaluable to the criminal network, allowing them to identify threats like Marcus before those threats could reach honest law enforcement. Dr. Elizabeth Stone's conviction for falsifying autopsy reports carried a sentence of 45 years in federal prison. Her testimony had revealed the systematic cover-up of at least 17 murders, including the 3 Lincoln High students who died before Marcus exposed the conspiracy that claimed their lives. Coach Williams, who'd cooperated with investigators and testified against his former associates, received 25 years as part of his plea agreement. His betrayal of Marcus remained the most personal wound. The trusted mentor who'd led his student to execution while promising protection and justice. The verdicts continued for hours as dozens of defendants learned their fates. Business owners who'd laundered money through legitimate enterprises, school officials who'd facilitated the exploitation of students, and law enforcement officers who'd protected criminals instead of citizens all faced sentences that would keep them imprisoned for decades. Federal prosecutors estimated that the network had generated over $200 million in illegal revenue during its 15-year operation. Asset forfeiture proceedings would eventually return portions of that money to communities that had been systematically robbed by officials they'd trusted and elected. The broader impact of the verdicts extended far beyond Lincoln's borders. Similar investigations launched in 17 other states following patterns Marcus's evidence had revealed. The teenager's courage had exposed a model of small-town corruption that criminal enterprises had replicated across rural America. Linda Chen addressed the media outside the courthouse after the final verdict, standing on steps where Marcus should have celebrated his high school graduation, his college acceptance, his wedding, and achievements that would never come. Marcus died believing that truth would eventually win, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd of reporters and supporters who'd followed the trials for 18 months. Today proves that he was right, even though he paid a price no child should ever pay for being honest and brave. The convictions represented more than legal justice. They vindicated Marcus's faith in a system that had failed to protect him, but ultimately honored his sacrifice. Every guilty verdict was a posthumous medal for courage that had cost a teenager his life but saved countless others from similar fates. Detective Torres announced her retirement following the verdicts, her career defined by the case that had consumed 8 years and ultimately redeemed a profession corrupted by those who'd sworn to serve and protect. Federal investigators revealed that Operation Mockingbird had uncovered criminal networks in 43 additional communities, all using variations of the model Marcus had exposed in Lincoln. The teenager's evidence had become a blueprint for identifying and dismantling corruption that had hidden behind the facade of civic leadership. But questions remained about how many other young people had died trying to expose similar conspiracies, their courage unrecognized and their sacrifice forgotten. Marcus Chen had been lucky enough, if luck was the right word, to document his discoveries and hide them where they'd eventually be found. How many other heroes lay in unmarked graves, their evidence buried with them And what would it take to ensure that communities across America never again betrayed the children who trusted them enough to do what was right? The Marcus Chen Memorial Gymnasium opened its doors on what would have been his 25th birthday, March 8, 2025. The rebuilt facility at Lincoln High School bore no resemblance to the haunted space where corruption had flourished under the guise of youth athletics. Linda Chen cut the ribbon while surrounded by FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and families of other victims whose justice had emerged from her son's courage. The plaque beside the entrance bore Marcus's photograph and a simple inscription. He believed that doing the right thing would keep him safe. His sacrifice keeps others safe instead. Treatise. The gymnasium's walls displayed photos of the 17 victims whose deaths had been disguised as accidents or suicides before Marcus exposed the conspiracy that claimed their lives. Sarah Martinez, David Thompson, and 15 others finally received the recognition they deserved as heroes who died protecting communities they'd never know they'd saved. Federal legislation inspired by Marcus's case created new protections for young whistleblowers who discovered evidence of corruption or criminal activity. The Marcus Chen Act established secure reporting channels that bypass potentially compromised local authorities, ensuring that brave teenagers wouldn't die alone while trying to contact honest law enforcement. The law also mandated federal oversight of communities where extensive corruption had been discovered, preventing the reconstruction of criminal networks in areas where trust had been systematically destroyed. Lincoln, Pennsylvania, became the model for how communities could rebuild after learning that their most trusted leaders had been their greatest threats. Detective Torres established a cold case unit specifically focused on deaths that might have been disguised murders, using Marcus's evidence as a template for identifying similar patterns across the country. Her team had already reopened over 300 cases where young people had died under suspicious circumstances. The ripple effects of Marcus's courage continued expanding years after his death. University criminal justice programs studied the Lincoln conspiracy as an example of how organized crime could infiltrate and control small communities through the systematic corruption of civic institutions. Linda Chen became a national advocate for whistleblower protections, speaking to audiences across America about the price her son had paid for trusting adults to do the right thing. Her foundation provided legal and financial support to young people who discovered evidence of crimes but feared the consequences of reporting what they'd learned. The Marcus Chen Foundation also funded technology that allowed secure, anonymous reporting of suspected corruption or criminal activity. The system, developed with FBI oversight, ensured that tips reached honest investigators without passing through potentially compromised local channels. Coach Williams died in federal prison 3 years into his sentence. His final letter to Linda Chen, expressing remorse that felt genuine but could never repair the damage he'd caused. His death closed one chapter of the story while leaving others unresolved. The professional killers who'd actually murdered Marcus were never identified or prosecuted. The federal trials had exposed the network's local operations while revealing connections to criminal enterprises that operated across international borders. Those larger investigations continued years after the Lincoln verdicts, following money trails and communication networks that Marcus's evidence had helped identify. Lincoln rebuilt its institutions from the ground up, establishing transparency, requirements, and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future corruption. New leaders were recruited from outside the community, bringing fresh perspectives untainted by the relationships that had enabled criminal control. The basketball program at Lincoln High was reinstated with strict ethical guidelines and federal oversight. The first game played in the Marcus Chen Memorial Gymnasium was attended by FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and families who understood that sporting events could be much more than entertainment. They could be opportunities for communities to demonstrate their values. Marcus's jersey number 23 was permanently retired, displayed in a case that also contained the evidence he'd hidden in Miller's woods. Visitors could see the waterproof case that had preserved recordings powerful enough to topple governments and save lives across multiple states. But perhaps Marcus's greatest legacy was the simple truth his death had confirmed. One person's courage could change the world, even when that person paid the ultimate price for their bravery. His story became required reading in schools across America, teaching children that doing the right thing sometimes required extraordinary sacrifice. The question that haunted everyone who learned Marcus's story wasn't whether he'd made the right choice. It was whether adults would finally create a world where children like him wouldn't have to choose between their safety and their conscience. How many other young heroes were out there, carrying dangerous knowledge and hoping someone would protect them for doing what was right? And would Marcus Chen's sacrifice finally be enough to ensure that brave children never again died alone, in the darkness, betrayed by the very people who should have kept them safe? 10 years after Marcus Chen walked into Miller's woods believing help was coming, Linda Chen stood in the same clearing where her son had taken his final breath. The forest had reclaimed the disturbed earth, but the truth Marcus died protecting continued growing, spreading roots that would never allow such darkness to flourish again. The anniversary brought federal agents, journalists, and families touched by Marcus's sacrifice to the memorial erected where his body had been discovered. The simple stone marker bore his name, dates, and a promise that his courage would never be forgotten by the communities he'd saved. Linda placed fresh flowers, sunflowers, Marcus's favorite, beside the marker, while reflecting on the decade that had passed since that terrible morning when Detective Torres called with news about a jogger's discovery in the woods. The final truth about Marcus Chen wasn't found in court records or federal investigations, though those had delivered the justice he'd sought. The real truth lived in the lives his sacrifice had protected, children who attended schools free. From corruption, communities served by honest officials, families spared the grief Linda carried every day. FBI Director Patricia Wells, who'd overseen Operation Mockingbird, delivered remarks that placed Marcus's story in the broader context of American justice. His evidence had triggered investigations in 47 states, resulting in over 800 arrests and the dismantling of criminal networks that had operated for decades. Marcus Chen died believing that one person's courage could make a difference, Director Wells said, her words carrying across the memorial crowd to reporters who would share his story with audiences around the world. He was right. His courage didn't just make a difference, it changed everything. The ripple effects continued expanding years after the initial trials. International law enforcement agencies used Marcus's case as a model for identifying communities where organized crime had corrupted legitimate institutions. His story became part of training curricula for agents working to protect whistleblowers who exposed dangerous truths. Universities across America established criminology scholarships in Marcus's name, ensuring that future investigators would study the techniques he'd used to document criminal activity while protecting himself, at least temporarily, from the consequences of discovery. Detective Torres, now heading the FBI's Domestic Corruption Task Force, addressed the memorial crowd about the ongoing fight against criminal networks that targeted communities like Lincoln. Marcus's evidence remained the gold standard for understanding how sophisticated criminal enterprises could infiltrate and control local governments. The memorial service concluded with Linda Chen's reflection on the son she'd lost and the hero he'd become. Her words transformed personal grief into universal inspiration, reminding everyone present that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose courage over safety. Marcus was just a 16-year-old boy who loved basketball and believed adults would do the right thing, Linda said, her voice steady despite tears that would never stop coming. He died because evil people couldn't allow good people to exist. But his death proved that evil always defeats itself in the end. It just sometimes takes longer than we'd like. The crowd dispersed slowly, visitors lingering to read Marcus's story on interpretive signs that detailed how one teenager's courage had exposed corruption across multiple states and inspired legislation that protected other young whistleblowers. As the sun set over Miller's Woods, Linda Chen remained beside her son's memorial, listening to evening birds sing in trees that had witnessed both his murder and the justice that followed. The forest held both darkness and light, death and renewal, betrayal and redemption. The final truth about Marcus Chen was that death hadn't silenced him. It had amplified his voice until it could be heard in communities across America, where corruption tried to masquerade as civic leadership. His story became a warning to those who would exploit children and betray public trust, and a promise to those brave enough to speak truth to power. In the end, Marcus Chen had been right about everything. Truth would prevail, justice would eventually come, and one person's courage could change the world. He'd simply paid a higher price for that truth than any 16-year-old should ever have to pay. The darkness that claimed Marcus Chen in Miller's Woods had been overcome by the light he'd preserved in a waterproof case buried beside his body. That light continued burning, a beacon for anyone brave enough to believe that doing the right thing, no matter the cost, was always the right choice. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one, and ensure that heroes like Marcus Chen are never forgotten.